Good morning again. Thank you for being here. Our thoughts and our prayers go out and up, I guess, for those still dealing with the fires, great loss of property and even lives. So again, continue to pray for that. Selfishly, and I don't mean to make light of this situation at all, there's a story about the fiery furnace coming up, and it almost lined up. It would be a pretty good segue into it, but we missed it by a couple of weeks. We will finish the story that we started last week, the story regarding Nebuchadnezzar's dream, one of them. I guess he was a dreamy dude, but this first dream, we saw the portion of the story that included the explanation of the context last week. Basically, Nebuchadnezzar, who at this point in time was the guy, the most powerful man in history at that particular time, was being tormented by reoccurring dreams. And he had resources like any other king would, a court full of wise men that he could rely upon to advise him and to interpret things. And here the story tells us that he went to them and explained that he needed this dream to be interpreted. Not only interpreted, but actually the content also needed to be explained as well. The wise men didn't have a chance, because one thing is for you to interpret something, another thing is for you to also give that something in a correct manner, and then follow that up with the correct interpretation. So they try to buy some time, try to argue with the king. The king hadn't slept for a while, so he was really cranky, to the point where he got the captain of the guard and said, "Off with their heads." All of them were to be killed. The issue is, within this context of the book of Daniel, is the fact that Daniel and his buddies were also a part of this group of wise people that the king relied upon. So eventually that decree would have affected them, their lives. They were in jeopardy. So Daniel overheard, and saw what was happening. He asked to have a meeting with the king and asked the king for some time. And then with that time, his friends and him prayed. And during that night, it is described that God actually revealed all of the information to Daniel. And the portion that we left off was a praise that Daniel lifted up to God, thanking him for allowing him to have this level of insight. And now we're at the part of the story where Daniel gets to go back to the king to inform him of his findings based on the vision that he received from God. So let's go ahead and read portion at a time. We'll start from verse 24 and go all the way to verse 30. And again, this is when Daniel approaches the king after receiving this revelation from above. And it says here, "Therefore Daniel went to Arioch, whom the king had appointed to destroy the wise men of Babylon. He went and said thus to him, 'Do not destroy the wise men of Babylon. Take me before the king, and I will tell the king the interpretation.' Then Arioch quickly brought Daniel before the king and said thus to him, 'I have found a man of the captives of Judah who will make known to the king the interpretation.' The king answered and said to Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar," man, I practiced that so much, Belteshazzar, are you able to make known to me the dream which I have seen and its interpretation? Verse 27, Daniel answered in the presence of the king and said, the secret which the king has demanded, the wise men, the astrologers, the magicians, the soothsayers cannot declare to the king. But there is a God in heaven who reveals secrets. And he has made known to the king Nebuchadnezzar what will be in the latter days. Your dream and the visions of your head upon your bed were these. As for you, O king, thoughts came to your mind while on your bed about what would come to pass after this. And he who reveals secrets has made known to you what will be. But as for me, the secret has not been revealed to me because I have more wisdom than anyone living, but for our sakes, who make known the interpretation to the king, and that you may know the thoughts of your heart. So again, now Daniel, he gets the opportunity to go before the king. So he talked to the captain of the guard who was in charge of slaughtering all the wise men. He had already asked for some time, and now this time had been expired. It was exhausted, and thank God, prior to the time being expired or exhausted, he did receive this revelation from above during night, a night vision. That's how it was described. And now he is before the king. And prior to him coming before the king, the captain of the guard sort of introduces Daniel, or reintroduces Daniel to the king. The king was a busy guy, probably had already heard of Daniel. We saw that in the beginning, that there was an acknowledgement of Daniel being one of the elites of those who were going to be trained to be wise men, those who were basically captives of the Babylonian Empire, but thought worthy to be in that position. And Daniel and his friends excelled to the point where they were thought of in very high regard. So again, Daniel is going to be introduced to the king, and the king is going to finally have someone who can reveal the secrets of this particular torment that he has been experiencing. It's interesting that when the captain of the guard introduces Daniel, the words that he utilized are poignant. On verse 25, it says, once again, then Arioch quickly brought Daniel before the king and said thus to him, I have found the man of the captives. He was probably well-intentioned. Maybe took a little bit of an opportunity to brag a little bit. The story doesn't really fit the description of how he is introducing Daniel. Daniel is the one that came to him and told him to, help out by allowing him to speak to the king, and then telling him, wait up, don't kill every wise man, give me some time so I can figure things out. But now the captain of the guard is here introducing Daniel, and he says, I found him out of the blue. I was searching, and I found this guy who can finally interpret your dreams, O king. So again, maybe a little bit bragging, maybe he was just well-intentioned. There was some honor, I guess, he was trying to give Daniel because he was the man, finally, out of all of the wise men, who could do that which was deemed impossible for anyone else. And as we see, it's kind of wordy, especially in the New King James Version here, but the emphasis of Daniel's introduction to what is about to happen was a focus upon God. Again, Daniel was introduced as the man who was found, and then instead of feeding off of this introduction, Daniel went on to say, look, there is this God in heaven who reveals secrets, right? And he has done so for our sake. Basically, Daniel said, God has revealed this secret to you through me. But it's not because I'm a particularly wise person. I'm not endowed with any special ability. The only special thing that happened here was the fact that God himself was willing to use me as a vessel so that he could give you insight into these dreams that you've been having. So again, the focus was solely 100% upon God. And this is important because later on, there's going to be some fruit that comes out of Daniel's introduction to what is happening here. Another information that is important is the fact that Daniel was explaining this in light of future events. Basically, what Daniel would elaborate on were things that were yet to come, and he was introducing this phenomenon by telling the king that these things are going to be descriptions of occurrences that will happen in later days. He goes on to say that it was about something that was coming to pass after this. So everything that was going to be explained, interpreted, light was going to shine upon certain information that would happen afterwards, into the future. As of right now, we don't know how far into the future, but we know that these are occurrences that have prophetic nature, things that have not yet occurred. So this is what happened, once again, when Daniel came before the king. Now from verse 31 to verse 35, Daniel is going to describe the dream. Once again, that was very important. This is an important part of the story, because the wise men not only were charged with interpreting the dream, but actually giving the description of the dream. We don't know for sure if that was due to the fact that Nebuchadnezzar himself didn't really fully remember clearly the dream, or he was putting these wise men to the test, wanting to see if in fact they had this insight that was truly special, and if they did, then they would be able to also give a description of the dream without being actually told what that dream was. So now it's that portion from verse 31 to 35. And it says here, "You, O king, were watching, and behold, a great image. This great image, whose splendor was excellent, stood before you, and its form was awesome. This image's head was of fine gold, its chest and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. You watched while a stone was cut out without hands, which struck the image on its feet of iron and clay and broke them in pieces. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, the gold were crushed together and became like chaff from the summer threshing floors. The wind carried them away, so that the trace of them was no trace of them was found. And the stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth." So very detailed description of the dream. Can you imagine Nebuchadnezzar hearing this? Again, whether or not he fully remembered the dream, he probably was amazed. I don't even know if he was expecting such great detail. And again, this was a very intense dream. So here it's just described as a matter of fact. But I think it was very fearsome. It was awe-inspiring. You know, you probably have seen illustrations of this statue-like structure with, you know, different portions made out of different types of metal. But I think it was especially fearsome and scary and intense. And again, it kept Nebuchadnezzar up for days. He could not sleep. He was tormented by this reoccurring dream. And now Daniel comes and he's explaining it all. He's saying, this is what you've been dealing with. This image of this human-like figure who has a head made out of gold, the torso made out of silver, the limbs down made out of bronze, and then eventually iron, and then the feet made out of both iron and clay. But that's not it. Not only do we have the description of this image, this man-like statue, eventually this stone, which was not cut by human hands, in other words, it's not man-made, comes like a flying boulder and hits this great, fearsome, awe-inspiring image right on the feet. And then everything comes tumbling down. And it's crushed to a powder, to the point where the winds come and it just carries all the dust away. And then this stone, this mighty stone that was able to crush this fearsome image and pulverize it to the point where only dust remained, it actually started getting bigger and bigger and bigger and more impressive, to the point where it just, you know, enveloped that whole region and the world. What an intense dream. What, can you imagine having these types of dreams over and over and over again and being tormented by them, not knowing what they meant, trying to figure it out, but couldn't on your own? No wonder Nebuchadnezzar was cranky. No wonder he was willing to slaughter all of these wise men who were worthless with regards to giving him the insight that was necessary. This was coming from God. God wanted to inform Nebuchadnezzar of something, but he needed a vessel. He needed a vehicle for that information to actually be tapped into. And Daniel was this person that God was utilizing for that purpose. Now let's move on. So we have the meeting, we have the description. And now from verse 36 to verse 45, we have the actual interpretation of this particular dream. And it says here, this is the dream. Now we will tell the interpretation of it before the king. You, O king, are a king of kings. For the God of heaven has given you a kingdom, power, strength, and glory. And wherever the children of men dwell, or the beasts of the field, and the birds of heaven, he has given them into your hand, and has made you ruler over them all. You are this head of gold. But after you shall arise another kingdom inferior to yours, then another, a third kingdom of bronze, which shall rule over all the earth. And the fourth kingdom shall be as strong as iron, inasmuch as iron breaks in pieces and shatters everything. And like iron that crushes, that kingdom will break in pieces and crush all the others. Whereas you saw the feet and toes partly of potter's clay and partly of iron, the kingdom shall be divided. Yet the strength of the iron shall be in it, just as you saw the iron mixed with ceramic clay. And as the toes of the feet were partly of iron and partly of clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly fragile. As you saw iron mixed with ceramic clay, they will mingle with the seed of man, but they will not adhere to one another, just as iron does not mix with clay. Verse 44, and in the days of these kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed, and the kingdom shall not be left to other people. It shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. Inasmuch as you saw that the stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, and that it broke in pieces the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold, the great God made known to the king what will come to pass after this. The dream is certain, and its interpretation is sure. So here, finally, we get the interpretation of the dream. We have these different elements that this image, this man-like statue, was made out of. We have gold, we have silver, we have bronze, we have iron, and we have finally iron mixed with clay at the base, at the bottom, at the feet. So even without a very detailed description, it is obvious that here we have these different elements included in the statue, and they are of lesser value as they move downward. The head made out of gold, the one that is most valuable. Then you have silver, then you have bronze, then you have iron, then you have iron mixed with clay. So decreasing value, decreasing worth. So that in and of itself, you wouldn't need much explanation. The explanation comes as to what those elements are. What do they mean? How do they fit together within this prophetic message that God wanted to provide to Nebuchadnezzar? Well, one thing is for sure. One thing is clear. Nebuchadnezzar was the golden head. Daniel made that very clear. Hereafter, or thereafter, everything is sort of still within speculative nature. We know that the other elements were these other empires, these other kingdoms that would come after the great Nebuchadnezzar and his Babylonian empire. Eventually, he and it would cease to exist. They would not be in power anymore, which is normal. That's kind of how history unfolds. Excuse me. You have a great power that arises. This power controls for a while. Eventually, this power is taken over by another power, and then that happens in succession over and over and over again. The detail that we have here is that, in fact, in one way or another, Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonian Empire were thought of as the one that was most glorious, the best, the ones that were most valuable in a way. We don't know exactly in which way, but the glory that Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonian Empire had would not be matched by these other subsequent empires that would rule that region of the world, or the known world for that matter. So there are certain educated guesses as to not only this general interpretation of these empires that would succeed Babylon, but they would be less glorious somehow, but possible historical interpretations, because if you fit that description into the account of known history, you see who came after and after and after. So the Babylonian Empire actually stayed in power for a little bit over 60 years. Again, glorious. Its prowess was unmatched in certain ways. But eventually, it ceased to exist, or it ceased to have that dominant position in the world. Eventually, the Persian Empire came and took over. And the Persian Empire actually lasted over 200 years. And it did its thing. It actually was more powerful in certain ways. So the glory that is being described here pertaining to the Babylonian Empire in comparison to these other empires, it didn't really point to military prowess. These other empires had bigger military force. It didn't pertain to vastness. These other empires did cover a larger portion of the world. But in one way or another, Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonian Empire were being considered as the cream of the crop, and everything else or everyone else would be a lesser version of them. So here comes the Persians. They are in charge for about 200 years. Eventually, the Greeks come, and they do the same. They are around, relevant, powerful. They expand for almost 200 years. And that is followed by the Roman Empire, who lasted a really long time. In one version or another, close to 500 years. So again, if we're just looking at the illustration or the interpretation of the dream as documented here, and we attach it to our known history, this is what it seems. It seems like it is a description of Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian Empire, followed by the Persians, the Greeks, and the Romans. That is the most logical interpretation, even though it is still up for, debate. Because the only one that we know for sure, based on the description, is that Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians, they were the golden head. But count with me. We have the golden head, the Babylonian Empire. We have the silver torso. We have the Persians. Then we have the bronze, which likely were the Greeks. And then we have the Romans, which might have been the iron. There's something left. What about the feet? What about the iron mixed with clay? What about that base or that foundation? This is the one that there's more debate about. The other ones, as I've stated, just looking at the chronology of history, how history unfolded and how these empires came to be and fell in succession, it seems to fit. It seems to make sense. But the description of the feet, it's interesting because nothing really matches. Nothing really fits in how this is being described and how this is being interpreted. So again, there are many possibilities as to what is being described here, what is being interpreted here, what fits into history. But one of my favorite ones, and why am I telling you my favorite ones? Because I can. Because I'm here and you're not. Now, it doesn't mean that it's the only one, and it doesn't mean that it's necessarily the best one. It is just my preferred one. But do your homework, for God's sake. There are, things out there, commentary, literature, little books written about this. A lot of speculation, a lot of possibility, a lot of content that is out there. I will expose briefly my favorite one. And it's not even that clear, even though it is my favorite one. So when we get to this portion of the image and the description of Nebuchadnezzar's dreams, of these empires, and now you get to the base, the foundation, the feet that is being described as a mixture of iron and clay. We get to something, I believe, I think, I suppose or assume, that has not occurred yet. Remember what Daniel mentioned? Daniel mentioned to Nebuchadnezzar, look, what we have here are things to come. Your dream, it's not about things that have already occurred. It's about things that are in the future. Now, if we're just limiting the Persians, the Greeks, and the Roman Empire, that was, in fact, in Nebuchadnezzar's future, but it's in our past. But possibly the base, the foundation, the feet are still in Nebuchadnezzar's future and ours as well. Why? There's really nothing that fits. Nothing really truly makes sense that has occurred. So here, very likely, we're talking about something that will happen eventually. A great empire will arise. And this empire seemingly is very powerful. Again, when it states that these empires would decrease somehow in value and glory, it doesn't mean that they are going to be less powerful with regards to might, with pure strength and influence and vastness. It's just an evaluation that is given, but we don't know actually for sure why Babylon is gold and Rome is iron. But there will come a point in time when another empire will arise. And this empire will have remnants of the Roman Empire, which is something that we've seen in history before. Leaders have risen to power, claiming that they want to kind of renew the Roman Empire, at least, a pseudo version of that. Because again, it was around for such a long time, people have a tendency to really glorify it. So seemingly, it's something that will occur in the future. But it is a lesser version of it because it won't match the Roman Empire and its reign and its influence and its rule for all of this time in history that we saw for, again, about 500 years. It will match in a sense, but it's also mixed with clay. In other words, there are weaknesses. It's going to be somewhat divided. You're going to have little cracks here and there. You're going to have imperfections. You're going to have weaknesses. Possibly even, based on the description of this foundation and base, this empire will be ruled by different persons. And if we really go into greater detail, crossing our T's and dotting our I's and speculating to the nth degree, maybe we can even look at the image and say, okay, 2 feet, 10 toes, possibly 10 rulers or entities that are in charge of this empire that is powerful but has weaknesses. And they don't fully come together. It's this collective of influential people, rulers, or nations that are in charge, but again, not completely and totally unified. However, something is going to occur. Something will happen because the description goes on. After this occurs, potentially in our future, there will come a point in time where judgment will take place. And this rock, this stone that is not cut by man's hands, in other words, not man-made, in other words, from God, because what's the other option? What is the other option? Will come and will destroy not only the feet, but everything will come down. Everything that was built up by human hands, all of the influence that the world has experienced that has human nature, human will, human desires and wants, and even needs, will be destroyed by this boulder, by this thing that cannot be matched by the greatest powers that the human world can fathom. What can that be? Who can this be? Well, again, continuing with our speculation, you know that Jesus himself referred to him as a stone that was rejected by men, but would be this primary, this cornerstone, potentially, possibly, probably. My best guess, my favorite interpretation, there will come a time when this stone will come crashing down, and it will crash down upon everything that human beings have built up for themselves, selfishly. Again, based on their own will, their own prowess, their own ideas and ideals, their own plans, their own preferences, their own desires. This stone will come crushing down, and it will pulverize it all in judgment. And when it's all said and done, only dust will be left. Not a remnant, nothing precious, only dust. And left would be the stone that increases and becomes even more prominent, more visible, highlighted by the fact that it is the only thing that is visible, that we can witness, that we can experience. Very likely, what we have here is a foretelling of future apocalyptic events. What will occur when Christ comes back. Not the only explanation, possibly a very good one, if not the best. But it's up to you to figure that out, because again, there are other possibilities. The story goes on. So from verse 46 to verse 49, we have now the conclusion of this mini stories. As I mentioned to you, the beginning of the book of Daniel is all about these stories, one chapter per mostly. So it says here, then King Nebuchadnezzar fell on his face prostrate before Daniel and commanded that they should present an offering and incense to him. The king answered Daniel and said, truly your God is the God of gods, the Lord of kings, and a revealer of secrets, since you could reveal the secret. Then the king promoted Daniel and gave him many great gifts, and he made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon and chief administrator over all the wise men of Babylon. Also Daniel petitioned the king, and he set Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the affairs of the province of Babylon, but Daniel sat in the gate of the king. And by the gate of the king, it meant, the court, the inner circle of the king. So here we have the conclusion of the story. But remember, in Daniel's first encounter, his introduction to the interpretation of this dream, he already established the ground rules. And what were the ground rules? It's not me. It's God. He is the one that is revealing this. And because of this, three things occurred. Nebuchadnezzar, the greatest human at that point in time, humbled himself. Not often had he done that. Humbled himself. God was acknowledged and glorified. And Daniel was correctly rewarded. being this vessel and this vehicle that God was utilizing for these purposes. But again, the humbling of Nebuchadnezzar and the glorification of God, along with Daniel being rewarded. Everything came to be as intended by God. How do we conclude this? Story is over. Amen. If we think about the elements that were here described, there are two items that I want to bring to the table as far as, application, just kind of conclusion that is a little bit more useful for our personal meditations, right? In light of this information. The first one is this. We tend to think of history as these isolated pockets of time, events. Sometimes they kind of relate to one another, but if we're thinking about one portion of time in comparison to another, they almost seem totally, distinct, right? Sort of like talking about the Roman Empire and its greatness in comparison to prehistoric events. They don't seem related at all. Here we're talking about dinosaurs and Caesar, right? Not related at all. But both can be considered history. But again, when we think of history, in the telling of history, we think of pockets of times that sometimes are isolated and entities within themselves. What we have here is more of a holistic, godly, divine description of history. From God's perspective, do you know what history is? History is merely the story that moves towards the coming and the return of the Messiah, eventually as king, in culmination of establishing his kingdom. That's history. I can't repeat that exactly, but more or less, to God, this is history. History is merely the story. It starts somewhere in creation, and it continues. And it goes on to the point where it reaches this climax, which is the return of Christ, succeeded by his original coming. And eventually it's culminated by the establishment of his kingdom. That's history. It is a singular story consisting of events. One leading to another, leading to another, leading to another, but for the sole purpose of the King of Kings being established in his rightful place as the sovereign one of all. That is history. History has only one climax, one point, one story. Everything else are these side quests, right? These parallel things that occur, but none of those things are the main point of the story. The main point of the story is yet to come. That's one observation. My next observation, the last observation, is this. This story contained precious metals, gold, silver, bronze, iron, and even clay. Not precious, but useful. There's a reason for that. Again, it matched the value that was placed relating to these empires. Not necessarily God's value, but how humanity interprets that, feeds off of that, values that and them. And it's interesting that even though you have all of these values, they all ceased to exist. Isn't that interesting? Everything. Literally pulverized. Becoming dust. Earthly things are fleeting. It doesn't matter how precious they may seem. Earthly things are fleeting. They're here today and can literally be consumed by fire tomorrow. It doesn't matter how valuable they are. It doesn't matter how many zeros they have. Hopefully after a 1 or a 2 or a 3 or whatever, right? If it's just zeros, then it's probably not good. It doesn't matter. Everything can be crushed, pulverized, consumed in a split second and gone. That teaches us something. It teaches us to, even though we are a part of this portion of history and have our lives and our ideas and our preferences and our ideals and our issues and our lives, we really truly need and should be concerned with things that can literally not be pulverized in a split second. Our value needs to be placed in a place and in a person that cannot be taken away. There is this story of a missionary. And I tell you this because it's what came to mind as I was reflecting upon this text. Some of you probably heard of this guy, Jim Elliot, a missionary in the 50s. Great guy, apparently. Never met him in person. But everything I hear about him, just solid dude. Studied theology, went to seminary school. Apparently very bright. Had a great future ahead of him from an academic theologian perspective, right? People already had plans, big plans for him. He decided to be a missionary. He wanted to minister to indigenous tribes, specifically one in Ecuador, if I recall. Yeah, probably. That part of the world. And his peers, his friends, his professors, people who he trusted even, questioned that, telling him, come on, do you really want to go preach to these tribes? Is that really, you have so many other options, so many better options. And the story goes that based on that, maybe not directly, but indirectly, there's this quote, this very famous quote that is attributed to him. Jim Elliot said, "He is not a fool that gives up that which he cannot keep in order to gain that which he cannot lose." Once again, he is not a fool that gives up that which he cannot keep in order to gain that which he cannot lose. Jim Elliot and his buddies went to Ecuador and died. Were killed by the very tribe that they were trying to minister to. That quote and that truth still remains. Stands true till this day. The story continues with his spouse, and it's a great story. If you don't know it, look it up. It's very inspiring. But yeah, he is not a fool that gives up that which he cannot keep in order to gain that which he cannot lose. Amen.